Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz. I'll be talking about a tested program to acquire pragmatically useful information from the future. This is a project that I have been doing for 45 years, and over those almost 5 decades, I've had thousands of people describe the future at a very specific date. And this is a preliminary report on that work. In 1978, I had left government in the early 70s. From 70 to 76, I was the special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations for Research and Analysis. I was also for 2 Chiefs of Naval Operation, and I was also part of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology discussion group on innovation, technology, and the future, and the Smithsonian Institution study group on innovation, technology, and the future. So I was deeply immersed both in the futurist world and in the geopolitical world of the military at a classified level. And my concern, after I had left government and had a little daughter who was had just recently been born, I got to thinking about what her world would be like, because my feeling at the time, and it was the general consensus of most people in the geopolitical world, that either by accident or deliberately, we were likely to have a nuclear war. Either something would go wrong and missiles would get launched, or that just the conflict of the Cold War would result in probably the Soviet Union and the United States having a nuclear war. And I wanted to know what the future, if that were to happen, would look like for my daughter. So in 1978, I decided to begin this experiment. And I decided that I would use the same Mobius consensus protocol that I had used in discovering archaeological sites, both terrestrial and marine, throughout the world, as well as solving several previously unsolvable murders and the theft of a famous racehorse. And the Mobius consensus protocol is I've described in great detail in a number of papers, including several that have been published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration and in other journals. Basically, I developed a technique beginning in the late 60s that was based on what I had learned by looking at how intelligence services operate, and also having been an investigative reporter, how you do that. And of course, the answer is you don't rely on a source, you get multiple sources, and what you're looking for is where they hold consensus. So I'll say a little more about this, but if you want to get into this in detail, go to academia.edu, search on my name, and you'll find a number of papers that describe it in great detail, or go to get my book, Opening to the Infinite, which describes it in even greater detail. So in 1978, having designed it, I began to collect remote viewing data from interviews. And the way it would work is a person would come in and I would say, well, today is, for instance, September the 16th. So I would say, I want you to go forward in time to September the 16th in the year 2050 and describe for me what you see. Now, why 2050? And the answer is because I had learned from going back into the past and looking at other research that other people had done, that if you get too far out into the future, you just don't understand what they're saying. I mean, for instance, if I had been doing this in, say, 1908, and somebody had told me as a remote viewer that I had a thing I could carry in my pocket that would let me talk to anybody in the world, how would I have understood that? What would I have made of that? So I didn't want to get too far out, and I wanted to get far enough out that it would cover much of my child's life. So in 78, I began and ultimately collected data from 4,000 people all over the world. All kinds of people. I would go to a conference and speak, and I would say, would anybody like to participate in an experiment? And volunteers would come forward, and I would ask them each individually to fill out a form that answered a bunch of questions that I would ask, and they would write it down, and then it would be transcribed into a computer. And then the way the consensus protocol works is you break it down to individual concepts, which are alphanumerically designated, and then you begin to do an analysis of literally concept by concept. There's nothing else in remote viewing that I'm aware of that has ever remotely done anything similar, and it produces an enormous amount of data, but nonetheless, that's what I did. So from 78 to 91, I collected and got these 4,000 people. In phase 2, from 91 to 96, I also focused in 2050, but I was interested in getting very specific groups to do it, because the more I thought about this, the more I wondered, is the specialty of a particular person, does that influence what they describe about the future? And I also wanted to know, because my own research and research at other, like SRI's research and at Princeton, was coming out showing that meditators did better than non-meditators, and I wanted to get a sense of whether that was true. So beginning in 96, I did 538 remote viewings using this monitored interview protocol. And then in phase 3 of the project, which began in 2018, I shifted to the year 2060 in order to compare the differences between 2050 and 2060. And also I stopped originally in 1991 because I was struggling with working out how can you evaluate this material for its accuracy. Now we know that meditators do better than non-meditators, and also that people's perceptions, it's hard to distinguish between people who are doing it rationally, that is, they're giving an answer that is based on intellectual assessment, as opposed to those that are doing it by acquiring precognitive information. So in this third phase, I also had a large group of people, over 1,000, who filled out a form on SurveyMonkey, and I asked them to give me their rational assessment of the future, so that I could get another 1,000 people who also filled out the form, but who were asked to remote view it. And I wanted to see whether when people think they're doing an intellectual assessment, are they involving also non-locally perceived information? And similarly, when they're looking at non-local information, are they actually just making rational assessments? So we got 1,000 people to be rationals. I got 1,000 people, about 1,200 people to be remote viewers. I did another whole series of 300 respondents to just doing individual interviews, because I wanted to see when people fill forms out, do they do it differently than when you actually have a personal interview with them? And also, I chose 2060 on the third phase because I wanted to see an answer to a question that I had never been able to answer and I hadn't seen anybody else answer, and that is, when people describe the future, are they describing a fixed future or are they describing the highest probability future at the moment that you're asking them the questions? And so these are parts of the things that I'm still analyzing. And as I said, I stopped in 91 because I needed to figure out how I was going to do these assessments. I had asked people to describe not only how things were, but also how we got there. And I had a lot of information about that. And I wanted to be able to see if there was a difference between the 2050 and the 2060 data. So I'm not going to be able to give you a complete assessment of all of this because I'm still doing the analysis of this data. I mean, there's over 10,000 pages in a database, so it's a long, tedious task. But anyway, after all the concepts were broken down at the 91 group, and I went through and I began looking at how things were developing. And that's what actually began the Schwartz Report, schwartzreport.net daily web publication that I put out, because I was trying to begin to get access through all kinds of journals and various studies and publications to begin to pick up these trends that the remote viewers were describing. So let me talk a little bit about this initial stuff. A selection of the preliminary observations from the 78 to 91 group. They predicted the disappearance of the Soviet Union. Now, that may seem kind of obvious now, but I can assure you that when I began to get this information, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, talking about the world and how safe it was, I started out by asking, have we had a nuclear war? And the viewers said, no, there hasn't been a nuclear war. And I said, oh, well, the world must be much safer then. And they said, no, actually, the world is much more dangerous. And I cut, what in the world? And I said, well, why is the world more dangerous? And they said, because of terrorism. In 1978, when I began this, the only terrorism that I knew about was the fighting going on between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland and the terrorist activities that were involved there. But of course, as you know from looking at the media, pick any day you like, we have experienced an enormous rise of terrorism. So I said to them, well then, if things are more dangerous because of terrorism, what's happened to the Soviet Union? And they said to me, it doesn't exist in 2050. And it stopped existing some years ago. And I thought, what? How could the Soviet Union, this is at the height of the Cold War, how could the Soviet Union just disappear? And I went around to friends who were involved in the geopolitical world, who were people who really extremely knowledgeable. And I said, can you give me any idea why the Soviet Union would disappear? And to a person, they said to me, yeah, that's complete nonsense. The Soviet Union's not going to disappear. What in the world are you talking about? But of course, Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. They began talking to me about climate change. They didn't call it climate change, but for instance, I was interviewing a person in Santa Monica, California, and I said to them, you know, I want you to go forward in time to 2050 and what do you see? And they said, well, a lot of it's underwater. I said, what do you mean underwater? They said, well, I don't know, but Santa Monica, Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach, Newport Beach, they're underwater, large parts of them. And it's happening all over the world. So I went around to a friend who was one of the leading climatologists in the country and said, can you tell me why parts of these cities would be going underwater? And they said to me, where are you getting this information? It's nonsense. And yet, of course, in 1991, American scientists published the first article on climate change, that at least the first one I ever saw, based on ice coring. And now, of course, we see climate change as a major issue, indeed an existential crisis. I asked about health care in the 78 to 91 group. And they said to me, well, there's going to be a bunch of pandemics. So what do you mean pandemics? I'm thinking Spanish flu, 1918. And they said to me, well, the first one is going to be a blood disease that crosses over from primates to humans in Africa, and it's going to kill millions of people. But that's just the first one. And of course, I went around to Deputy Director of National Institutes of Health and asked him, did he know anything about a blood disease crossing over from primates to humans that could kill millions of people? And he also said, this is nonsense. And then in 1981, the AIDS epidemic began and killed 35 million people. They described the transition out of the carbon energy era, that the end of the internal combustion engine, and the development of virtual reality. I started, as I said, in 91, I stopped collecting data because I had so much of it already, and I needed to figure out how I was going to assess it. And so I began what became the Schwartz report. And then I did that for several years. And then in 96, I began another phase, and I started collecting again. And what came out this time that really stood out for me was, again, the inundation and collapse of coastal cities, the creation of electric-powered commercial aircraft, and the rise of a cashless society in which biometrics vouchsafed payments. I would say, you go into a store and how do you buy something? And they would say, well, you either have this thing that's embedded in your wrist, or they look at your eye. And I said, well, what about credit cards? And they said, no, it's gone past that. So in 2018, having looked at this data and assessed that it was pretty much like the data that I got in the archaeology projects, I began to look at things, only this time I looked at 2060, because as I said, I wanted to know, are people describing a fixed future or the highest probability that they're asked? So I thought I'll compare the 2050 and 2060 data and see what comes out of that. One of the things that I got was a strong confirmation of the earlier phases. And this particularly, what has stood out for me from 2018 to the present time, is that between 2040 and 2045, several very dramatic changes are going to occur that are going to alter the structure of human culture worldwide. At first, I thought it was a single thing. And when I talked to people about it, they said, oh, well, maybe extraterrestrials will contact us or something, and that'll bring the change. I don't think that's what it is. I think what's these people are talking about are several things combining together, sort of coalescing. One is the dramatic change that climate change is going to cause. that there are going to be multiple migrations in the United States internally. 3, one away from the coasts because too much water, one out of the Southwest because of heat and lack of water, and one out of the central states because of catastrophic weather events like tornadoes. So this climate change and sea rise, I think, is one of the big issues of 2040, 2045. The other is, I think that what I had originally begun to collect about the end of the internal combustion engine, a number of countries have now committed themselves to ending the internal combustion engine in 2040. One of the interesting things is that the remote viewers told me when I said to them, well, how do people charge these cars? Because what I was hearing at that point was a kind of recreation of the gas station model, that is charging stations. They said, no, what's really that starts it out the way, but what really happens is that they build roads that charge the vehicles that drive on them, and that is now happening. So I think what we're looking at is that these people are being highly accurate. The remote viewers tell me that people are going to largely reorganize into smaller communities, that cities will be not exactly abandoned, but that the large office buildings will be turned into apartments or low-income housing or vertical farms. And all of those things are now happening, exactly as predicted. They've told me, and this I've been particularly focused on, that the United States would still exist in 2060, but real political power would devolve down to the states and groups of states that would work together. That the illness profit system of healthcare in the United States, which is one of the worst in the developed world, would give way to a universal birthright, single-payer healthcare, more like the present European model. Okay, so here we are. Let me take a look at this so that you can see. So how accurate is this information? Well, I've tried to describe for you some of the things which I've already been able to assess and which are very clearly they were accurate, but I want to place it in a larger context. Non-locally, how accurate has this non-locally sourced information proven to be? Well, based on the research experience of over half a century using this Mobius consensus protocol in a whole range of applications, and also looking at the work of SRI and Princeton and some others who've done research in remote viewing, about 35 to 40% of the concepts that are offered by remote viewers prove impossible to evaluate. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. They could, in fact, be right, but it's impossible to determine. For instance, if I ask you to describe a ship and you describe an anchor, well, of course, it's a ship, anchors. But to give you an example, an actual example, if you just tell me that the captain had an amethyst chandelier in his cabin, I don't expect to see that. So this low a priori material is what I'm particularly looking for, that and consensus, of course, as I said earlier. So 35 to 40%, you just can't evaluate. You don't, it may be right, you don't know. There's no way to test it. Of the remaining 60 to 65% of the concepts, between 75 and 90% have proven to be correct or partially correct, but operationally useful. For instance, if I ask you to describe an individual and you said, well, it's a man and he's wearing a black shirt, and in fact, he was wearing a blue shirt, dark blue shirt, well, that would be partially correct. So we expect to see between 75 to 90% in all these archaeology experiments I've done and these murders and all the rest of it have proved to be correct or partially correct, but operational. The remaining 10 to 25% of the concepts are incorrect. So information of this quality, when applied to the future targets without any other sources of information, given the accuracy level, can be used to be extremely valuable to guide decisions and actions. And that, in fact, is what I'm now focused on, using this information that's been developed and that we can begin to see the trends developing to support it, to make decisions about the future. And so to date, to the degree that I can assess it yet, the degree of the accuracy level of the information coming out of this project appears to be 83%. And that would be completely consistent, as I said, with the work that has been done in other projects over half a century. So, as I said, 78 to 91, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the catastrophic rise of climate change, the rise of terrorism, the AIDS epidemic, the failure of antibiotic medicine, the transition of out of the carbon energy era, the universality and the rise of the internet, which in 78, 79 was just beginning, and which these people describe as much more sophisticated. I think what we're going to see is the development of the hologram, the idea that people no longer are working in office buildings, but they're working from home. And as I say, with the development of that, I think we're going to see of the hologram, I think we're going to see more and more of that. But we already see it in a number of American cities. The collapse of office real estate is becoming a real issue. And so, as I said, in 91 through 96, the second phase of the study, and that saw the inundation and collapse of American coastline, massive internal migrations, the rise of small communities, the creation of electric-powered commercial aircraft, and the rise of cashless society. Between 2040, 2045, we see these dramatic changes that are happening all over the world. I've already described that. And by 2060, we see that the end of the internal combustion engine. This has become very notable, particularly in the 2060 data. Not a single remote viewer describes gasoline-powered vehicles. And they do describe this business of electric vehicles. You drive on the road and it charges. So if I were investing in technologies, that's one I would be looking at. And climate change involved with sea rise that's caused the submergence. I do not think that we understand or fully appreciate as a society what climate change is going to do. What I get from all of these remote viewers and what I am now seeing in the climatology and geological information, the journals, studies that are coming out, is that this is going to be a dramatic change, which is going to involve millions of people becoming either migrants internally or immigrants to other countries. And in fact, that whole countries are going to disappear. So in North America, I expect that there will be migration away from the coast because of sea rise, as I said, southwest because of rising temperatures, lack of water, and out of the central states because of catastrophic events. People have organized, as I've said, in smaller communities. I found that very interesting. And they also describe a much more minimalist kind of architecture in buildings, and that these smaller communities, we really have become two different countries. And you can see almost daily in the news this trend developing, the red-blue trend. I mean, it's been particularly noticeable after the Dobbs decision, where you have states like Idaho, where it's almost impossible now to get an OBGYN. So for a woman who's pregnant, I don't know what they're going to do for medical care, because we are developing what are described in the medical literature as medical deserts. Very scary stuff, this split between the red and the blue. So the United States still exists, as I've said. The illness profit system has given way to universal birthright, healthcare, and that the whole way in which the economy works is radically changed. Almost nobody describes money or even credit cards. They describe, as I said, either the iris or some kind of embedded chip. So that's the world. Wait a minute. That's the world that I see coming. I'm going to continue this project. I'm now beginning to look at developing interviews with people to ask them to further define the things which I have already been able to get out of the data. It's all up in a huge database, but I'm now sufficiently confident about the quality of the material that I want to further refine it. And I'm also interested in focusing on specific technologies which will help us get through the climate change. One of the big things that I see here and occurring, and I'm also I don't see a lot in the current day 2023 media, is the idea that we are having a new paradigm emerge, that materialist physicalism. It's not that it's wrong, it's that it's inadequate, and that we need to understand that all life is interconnected and interdependent, and we need to begin to develop social policies that recognize that. So the idea that consciousness is causal and fundamental, as Max Planck told us back in 1931, is becoming, I think, the new paradigm. And I would say that the kind of work that people who are involved with the SSE are doing is going to become critically important, because the consciousness research community is the community that is becoming sophisticated in understanding how non-local consciousness works, exploring what the continuity of consciousness actually means and what are its implications, and understanding also how to create creativity events. Because when you look at creativity, what you see is that whether it's a scientist having an insight about something scientific, or whether it's a person meditating and having some kind of spiritual epiphany, or a remote viewer, like a remote viewer in this project describing something, that all of it is about accessing non-local consciousness and acquiring pragmatically useful information. So it's been an amazing project. I will be continuing on it, and I suspect I will also continue to report on it. So I thank you very much, and I will let you know what happens.